Here is the picture that passengers are walking into. Airlines have already cut 1,000 flights through Sunday across 40 of the busiest airports in the United States. That is not a scare line. That is the scoreboard. Late today, officials warned it could get worse. If the shutdown drags on, as many as 20% of flights could be at risk, 1 in 5. Anyone who has ever tried to reroute during a cancelled connection knows what that means. You do not just lose one flight. You lose the downstream options, the seats on later legs, the hotel rooms near airports, the rental cars that evaporate. When 100 other people try to reach the desk at the same time, disruption does not add up in simple lines. It multiplies. Travelers are already feeling it. Delays pile up early and ricochet through the day. Our team hears the same thing from Houston to Newark, Baltimore to Los Angeles. The pattern repeats. A line builds at security. The metal detectors slow to a crawl. The first bank of departures slips by 15 minutes, then 30, and suddenly the entire board is littered with yellow and red. At Chicago O'Hare, the misery index spiked again. People like Dee Jones debated turning around at the curb. She had a wedding in Houston at 2 in the afternoon. Driving would not work. Flying barely did. After multiple delays, she made it. But not because the system worked. She made it because she gambled and got lucky. The sight lines from Texas tell the same story. At Houston's Bush Intercontinental, the queue for TSA stretched so far, it coiled out of the terminal and onto the sidewalk. Announcements warned that waits could exceed 3 hours. That is the part that shocks people who do not fly often. Once you are in that line, there is no skip button. Even if you arrive 2 hours early, like the websites tell you to, you can still be late. That is how the shutdown turns a day off into a gauntlet. The unknown becomes the most stressful part. Will your flight be cancelled today? Will your connection vaporize while you are still taxiing to the gate? Do you get there 3 hours early to be safe, and then sit for another 3 hours because your plane is now out of position? Every decision becomes a bet, and the house has better information than you do. That is why people lean on gallows humor. Someone jokes that after the third delay, the only thing left is to go to the bar and fork over $27 for a beer. A pundit mixes up A and A, confusing the support group with the travel organization, and then sheepishly admits he might need both before this is over. But the TUA spokesperson who was actually traveling made a point that should not be lost in the laughter. This is just the beginning if the shutdown continues. Build a backup plan. Make sure your airline app is updated. Know the alternate airports near your destination. Have a same-day train or bus option for shorter routes. Bring chargers, medications, and food, because airport stores are not designed for waves of stranded travelers all hitting the shelves at once. That is not alarmism. That is adult advice in a situation created by people who refuse to act like adults. Safety is the line you cannot cross, and the shutdown pushes every staffing and fatigue variable closer to that line. Air traffic control is a finely tuned system. When you remove a slice of capacity, the safest response is to reduce the number of flights. That is exactly what the FAA has done by ordering a 10% reduction across the top 40 markets. Think about what 10% means on a weekday at a large carrier. For a single airline like Delta, there can be roughly 540 flights. Those are not just numbers in a spreadsheet. Those are crews who do not get paid flight hours, passengers who miss life moments, and aircraft that fall out of rotation so that tomorrow's plan is already brittle before the day begins. The viral intercom moment hit because the flight attendant put the mechanics in plain language. Day by day, the day before, if possible. Flights will be cancelled as long as the government requires cuts. Not random. Not targeted at the loudest complainers. Priorities are set to keep the most critical and efficient parts of the network moving. International flights first, because those schedules link multiple countries and crews with extra layers of regulation. Then, hub routes that anchor the airline's entire operation. Flights through Atlanta, New York, Detroit, Minneapolis, Seattle, Salt Lake City, Los Angeles. Protect those and you can save the backbone. Everything else becomes fair game. Regional connections, point-to-point routes that do not touch a major hub, late-night turns that require delicate crew timing. That is where the axe falls, because that is how you prevent the rest of the system from stalling. He also spelled out your rights. If the airline cancels and you choose not to travel, you are entitled to a refund. Not a voucher unless you accept one. A refund. The app should process it. It might take a few business days to land in your account, but the rule is clear. That matters because when you're exhausted and standing at a counter, it is easy to accept the first thing offered, just to end the conversation. When the mass cancellations hit, knowing what you can ask for is the difference between getting stuck with credit you will never use and getting your money back. The part that makes people furious is not just the cancellations. It is the cause. A shutdown is a choice. It is a pressure tactic. And in this case, it is being driven by the same politicians who tell you they are fiscal geniuses. The Republicans in control of the lever refuse to negotiate, while the government is open, then reject reasonable proposals to reopen, with the promise of good faith talks on healthcare costs that affect millions. The Democrats proposed an extension of healthcare subsidies to keep premiums under control, while a short-term funding bill stabilizes the government and allows agencies to do their jobs. Republican leadership immediately labeled it a non-starter. That is not a negotiation stance. That is a demand for unilateral surrender dressed up as principle. It is also a dare to the public to forget who is holding the lock on the door. The reaction online to the flight attendant's remarks speaks for itself. People who live in the real world hear a worker lay out constraints and priorities, and they recognize honesty. He did not deliver a partisan rant. He delivered a briefing. He explained that crews do not control federal orders. He explained that prioritizing hubs is about keeping as many travelers moving as possible. He explained that refunds exist because the government requires them when flights are canceled. And he reminded everyone that until Congress returns to Washington to vote, the folks in the cabin are stuck implementing choices made far above their pay grade. The people raging most loudly are the ones whose storyline cannot survive contact with those facts. They accuse him of slamming Republicans. But if a plain statement of cause and effect feels like an attack, maybe the problem is the cause and effect. Follow the ripple effects beyond the terminal. Airports are city-sized ecosystems. When flights are cut by 10%, restaurants and shops bleed revenue. Airport workers, who are hourly, lose shifts. Rideshare drivers wait in staging lots that do not refill. Hotels near hubs see a mix of sudden spikes from stranded travelers and sudden drops from those who never arrived. Supply chains take punches too. Belly cargo in passenger jets moves everything from medical supplies to high-value components. Cancel those flights and you force freight into smaller pipelines with less flexibility. In remote communities that rely on regional connections, a cancelled daily flight can strand essential workers. The system is interconnected by design, which is also why it is fragile when the people who fund and staff it are treated like negotiating pawns. Then there is the human side inside the cockpit and the tower. Controllers cannot simply be swapped in like spare parts. They are trained for specific facilities, certified for specific sectors, and bound by duty limits designed to keep fatigue from creeping into decision-making. When hiring pipelines slow and paychecks get uncertain, professionals look elsewhere. That is not a threat. It is a reality. If you cannot guarantee income, some people will leave to provide for families. Rebuilding that experience is not like flipping a switch. The shutdown tax on institutional knowledge is paid over months and years. The same is true for maintenance. Deferred inspections and stretched crews are not a sustainable plan. Airlines cannot simply ignore regulatory checklists. When there is less slack in the system, a single aircraft going out of rotation for an extra inspection can wipe out an afternoon of departures in a smaller station. Multiply that by a network thinning itself by 10% every day, and you understand why the delays linger even on mornings that start clear. Some argue that shutdowns are an acceptable tool to enforce bargaining. That would be easier to entertain if the people advocating them bore the consequences. They do not. The people who pay are the travelers sleeping on the floor near gate seat because all the cots at the end of the concourse are gone. The parents trying to explain to a crying child why they cannot make grandma's birthday. The service member counting the hours of leave tick away in an airport chair. The small business owner missing a pitch meeting that will not be rescheduled. The crews who keep smiling through the cabin service while they wait for the next notice that their pairing has been cut and their paycheck will be light. What the flight attendant did was pull the curtain back on the triage. International first to preserve treaty obligations and long-haul crew timing. Hubs next to keep the backbone alive. Regionals sacrificed because a few large arteries can carry more of the body's blood than a spiderweb of capillaries. It is clinical, and it is the least bad way to mitigate harm. It is also a reminder that you cannot ignore physics and math just because a talking head tells you to. If you are flying, here is how to deal with the reality. Monitor your booking the day before. Recheck it the morning of. If you have a non-hub connection, consider asking the airline to route you through a major hub even if it adds time. Hubs are being protected. Bring snacks and a refillable water bottle, because lines are unpredictable and the gate area kiosks will sell out. Screenshot your itinerary and any airline notices so that when you speak to an agent you can reference times and offers without relying on a congested app. Know the nearest alternate airports and the last flights of the day out of each. If your flight is cancelled and you cannot find a reasonable rebook, request the refund. Use that money on an alternate carrier, if necessary, or on a different mode of transportation. Keep receipts if you incur extra costs, because while shutdown-related cancellations are not likely to trigger mandatory hotel or meal vouchers, some airlines will make goodwill exception when the disruption stretches